Unfortunately, recently I've not been able to do live because YouTube have been cutting me off. So I thought, okay, we'll do Facebook Live today, which I don't normally do, but it's a chance. So questions from the man who asked the questions, if you got.
Is Boris correct to resign? Boris Johnson, is he correct to resign?
Well, the whole story emerged supposedly because of his Partygate thing. So it emerged because there was disgust within the population when they found out that the Prime Minister and others were having parties during the lockdowns, when the rest of us were told we couldn't. Now, of course, the Liberals want to argue that Boris Johnson's behaviour was outrageous. And of course, the hypocrisy of it is true. But at the same time, what it really represented was that the government, who were informed by advisors and scientists and so on, or they claimed to be so, the government didn't believe a word of what they were telling everyone else. And yet they got everyone else to behave by certain strictures. And so that, I think, is the key thing about that. It's not about him breaching lockdown rules. The lockdown rules themselves were wrong. And all the evidence now points to that. There was no benefit from lockdowns. And I was just looking in, I've been doing research on the Chinese lockdowns now. And the funny thing was, I found out this week that the government in China were advised on the 3rd of February, so the lockdown came, going right back to 2020, the lockdown came on the 23rd of January. But on the 3rd of February, in other words, about 10 days later, the Chinese government were advised that there was no need for any lockdowns anymore, that they needed to remove the restrictions. And on the 10th of February, Xi Jinping attended a meeting with all the data in front of him, and it showed that the number of people infected was going down before the lockdown. Before the lockdown, the infections were going down. And then they found that in China, when they first started measuring the so-called asymptomatic, they found 80% of those who tested positive were asymptomatic. And this continued. The more tests they did, the more asymptomatic they found. And it was concluded by the head of the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at that time in April 2020 that the asymptomatic scale showed that this had already been around for a long time. Whatever it was had already been around in the world, circulating for a long, long time. Otherwise you wouldn't have 80% infected but nothing wrong with them. So this was the point, is that either there was cross immunity or they already had immunity to this specific agent that was said to be causing the illnesses. And so firstly, the lockdown, this was in China, the first country. And then when you look at the studies from all around the world of the lockdowns, when they locked down, the numbers began to fall in any case. Whether they locked down or not, whether it was strict or not, the numbers began to fall. And so the evidence they were basing their arguments on were totally and absolutely false. And then they shifted balance from about April 2020. They shifted their emphasis to saying that we need to restrict people's movements because we haven't yet got therapeutics and we haven't yet got vaccines. That was the argument they made. And that was because they were lobbied by the big vaccine companies, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, in order to promote their vaccines. And so it then became no longer a question of, are people coming down ill, but how do we create the fear necessary to get everyone to run off to the local church and have a jab in their arm, or 2 jabs in their arm, or 3 jabs in their arm. And then the whole hysteria began. Before we knew what we were doing, they were talking about second wave. And how did they create the second wave? They created the second wave by a testing mania, which was launched in Britain, by the way. And that's where Boris Johnson was completely wrong. Because don't forget, at the very beginning, I stood here at Speaker's Corner and called for a lockdown. I was wrong. But I did that. Boris Johnson at that time, or at the beginning of January, in February actually, he turned around and said lockdowns would be a disaster and no one should have a lockdown. So he was right and I was wrong. So I'll give him that due. You've got to give credit where credit's due. Boris Johnson's natural instinct about coronavirus was correct vis-a-vis nearly all the government ministers and scientific advisors around the world. However, what Boris Johnson was one thing he certainly is a man of big business and a man of opportunity. And so as the big businesses came and lobbied Boris Johnson, he began to fall under their sway. He got classics from university. So he's a little bit educated from Oxford University, and he moves in the circle of all the posh kids from Oxford and also the elite families. So they have a certain, knowledge base from that. But otherwise, his knowledge base is very low. He doesn't spend his time doing great amounts of research. He sways with the wind, depending upon which interest groups and lobbies financially shape the direction. So what happened was Dominic Cummings dominated the political decision-making in Britain, and he said that the Bill Gates-type networks and Patrick Vallance came to him in March 2020 and stated mRNA vaccines and a national and global program to transform medicine based on coronavirus was necessary, and it would be similar to the Manhattan Project in the Second World War to develop the nuclear bomb, or similar to the Marshall Plan, a massive global investment program initiated by the wealthiest countries to reorganize the entire pandemic response and healthcare response and social response and lockdown actions and testing regimes and therapeutics and injections. All that will be done at once, rather than done sequentially, as would be done in any rational circumstance. Those were the words, paraphrased almost exactly, of Dominic Cummings at the inquiry in March 2021. And so here you have it, that they admitted that they were pushed by Big Pharma, by the technocratic maniacs who had been preparing for around 2 decades to convince the population that there was some kind of pandemic around the corner waiting to happen, which had to be acted upon as a global response by the major powers in the world. And the consequence of that was they changed the regulations. They said a pandemic means a disease, a flu-like illness that gets many people in many countries, instead of an illness that kills many people in many countries. The consequence of that was the transformation of medical surveillance into a system for global tyranny and control over the population. And that's what we saw. We saw the introduction of tyrannical regimes of dictatorial power that Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler would have been proud of, all based on modern technology. And it's not just finished with the coronavirus. The ULEZ campaign, Piers is always going on about the ULEZ campaign. You go around, I just spotted with my cousin here, the ULEZ campaign. The cameras around town, you see the ULEZ cameras. Those cameras are not looking for cars that are breaching the ULEZ regulations to come in August. They're looking for all cars. They're monitoring every car. In other words, they're monitoring where everybody goes at any time. Not only are they monitoring the cars, but they can also do facial recognition. So all around London they're putting up cameras designed to do facial recognition and to monitor where everyone is at any time. What possible benefit can there be? The purpose is, of course, to extend the dynamics of control and surveillance over the population. They want to know where you are, what you're doing, what you're thinking, and how to market their nonsense to you 24/7. And that, of course, the latest thing they got, there's a war now going on between artificial intelligence companies and these companies that want you to wear a screen on your face. Meta, Facebook? We're broadcasting on Facebook at the moment, thank you very much. But Facebook was subsumed under Meta. And Meta was all about put a screen on your face, around your head, enter a new world where you're safe, where you can't get viruses, where you don't have to put a mask on, where you can stay at home, where you can interact with people, where you can meet people, where you can have sex with people, where you can talk to people, where you can communicate with people. An unreal third world that you enter, and where every action you do is part of the accumulation of knowledge about what you are. They will know, and they do know, more about you than you know about yourself. And therefore, when you turn on the internet, something appears on your screen and pushes you to purchase something, or to do something, or to follow something, or to vote some way that they want you to do without you knowing that you're choosing to do that. They are pushing you to do particular things. They call it nudging. They used to have something called under David Cameron, the nudge unit. So what do they say? First they tell you, we got a consultation about restricting the movement of people in this area to make a lovely community for everyone. It's just where you are, so you don't have to leave home, don't have to go too far. 15-minute cities, we'll call it. You can cycle around, they put cycle lanes down. They say they're consulting about it, but actually they're already doing it. And the consultation is to nudge you to accept it, to get you gradually have a little discussion with your family at home and your friends and your neighbours, and gradually you come round to their point of view without them having forced you to make a decision. With the ULEZ thing in London, supposedly to wipe out legacy cars that are polluting the air, that's what they're saying. But in reality, it's nudging you into accepting their tyrannical powers in the name of hot weather. You know, it's a hot day today, and everybody's going around saying, oh God, how hot it is, it's terrible, monstrous weather today. In America, you know, that New York, you see the news this week? New York has got smoke in the air. Jodie Comer is her name, the actress, started coughing at an event, and it's impossible to breathe because they got smoke in the air flying in from Canada, and that supposedly is caused by climate crisis and climate change. In other words, the stuff you breathe out, or stuff I'm breathing out now, supposedly is causing the air to warm up, and that's causing forest fires in Canada, which is causing smoke in the air, which is making our friend Anthony here wear a mask on his face just in case it happens here. Just in case. At the ready to put it up at any moment, just in case a fire breaks out. And they're predicting thunderstorms in a few minutes. So I better cut that later on when the thunderstorm comes. I go, they're predicting thunderstorms and they get lightning in at that moment. That's what we need. But anyway, we'll wait for that moment to arrive. And so, but in reality what they've done is, because all the eco supporters have been prominent within the government and around the government, advisors. So in Canada they've said, the forests, you know, a lot of it's pine forest, big pine, Canada pines and all this. So the great big pine forests grow. And when the needles fall to the ground, and when the debris falls to the ground, you get a lot of dry tinder on the ground. And that dry tinder, one lightning strike, it starts on fire. So unless you are engaged in an active policy of managing the forests and clearing the ground, you will get forest fires exacerbated by not clearing the ground. And because the Greens have been arguing that you should leave nature as it is, don't touch the forests, leave them as they are, that's why the fires are happening in Canada. And then they say, oh my God, look what's happening in New York, no one can breathe. It's caused by the policies of the people who are saying that this is the cause, you know, that the CO2 and so on is the cause of the climate crisis. And by climate crisis they mean whenever it's a hot day, they tell you there's a climate crisis. So you look in the news today, it'll say heat wave in London, and we all know there's a heat wave in London today, right? So look at the news tonight and it will say hottest day of the year. And then underneath the article, somewhere in the article on the BBC, on the Guardian, on the Independent and the other newspapers, there'll be something that says hottest day, London hotter than Ankara. And then they'll say something underneath, an individual day cannot be attributed to the climate crisis, but there's an increasing tendency to have really hot days during the summer because of the climate crisis caused by CO2. So in other words, the cameras that are watching you, put there by Sadiq Khan, to survey everybody in the City of London all the time, facial recognition and recognition of everywhere you go, all that is justified by this nonsense they talk about climate change causing a hot day. What about the last 6 months? I remember 2 weeks ago, it was colder than at any time in decades. For 6 months it was colder in Britain. You remember that? They didn't post, oh my God, it's cold. How cold is it now? Oh my God, you know, they said the last couple of days, spring has come. Well, what happened to spring? The spring season passed on the 1st of June. And yet up until the 1st of June, it had been freezing. Throughout the whole period they called spring, it was freezing. How many degrees was it below the average at that time? And yet they claimed climate, whenever anything happens unusual, unusual, what is unusual in weather? Nothing. Nothing's unusual in weather. Every country has changes in weather. The very nature of weather, that's the whole stupidity of it. There is no time, anywhere, there's no time when you can say, oh, it's the 11th of June, 2023. Was it warmer or colder last year on the 11th of June at whatever it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon? Was it colder or warmer 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago? It's never going to be the same temperature one day to the next. So the very term climate change is a nonsense, and the very term climate crisis is also complete and absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And yet they've got the entire world's government running along behind this nonsense. What is it about? It is that the big capitalist companies in the world, oil companies, gas companies, banks, insurance companies, pension funds, pharma companies, chemical companies, wind farm companies, solar panel companies.
Get on with it.
Shut up. Muppet. Where are you going? Thank you very much. About time too. Tea, please. Tea, please. Come in a wee bit, ladies and gentlemen. Come in a wee bit. That's it. Step forward. Go on, go on. I'll give you a virus, eh? Give you a couple of viruses to take home.
So isn't distilling fear, whether by any profession, journalism, medicine, science, isn't that the source of interaction between individuals? Because if there was a core, there'd be no interaction.
Well, those of you who've studied what's going on, you'll know that in the last year, in the Western world, there's been an unprecedented excess death rate across the Western world and Australia and New Zealand. It just happens to be that all the countries that have had major jab programs with mRNA jabs. But that's probably just coincidental, isn't it? So in all those countries where there's massive excess deaths, nobody seems to be interested in why those excess deaths are happening. There are no investigations in the newspapers, no investigation, no panorama program, what's causing the excess deaths, why are people dropping like flies in all age groups, without having COVID, in all age groups, dropping like flies. 1,000 or 2,000 people a week in England and Wales are dying every week in excess of normal, in all age groups. And yet there's no investigation. You have to go on the internet to have any discussion about that. And there on the internet, I was going to say to peers actually, this week, you know, this counter-information unit they were talking about, where they're spying on the population and then feeding people what they're allowed to look at and what they're not allowed to. What qualifications did these people have in order to censor us? I wrote into them, when I saw this week, I wrote into them, I said I want to have my subject access request, so all my records that they got from that period, 2020 until today, that the counter-information unit had. But there were others, the 77th Brigade, the Army were involved in monitoring peers over there, and the rest of us who were campaigning against the tyranny imposed on the world. The Army was involved in doing it. What qualifications do they have? And so now I read this morning because I was thinking about Boris Johnson. You know, by the way, I hope we can get peers. Can we get peers? Can we get confirmation that you will stand against Boris Johnson?
I will.
Good.
Yes.
Boris Johnson constituency.
And if you want to know more, it's the Telegram group. Piers.
No, let's forget the
Piers,
later.
Corbyn, 4 number, Uxbridge, and I'm sorry.
And I think that's
Sam
very,
Price.
I think it's thoroughly appropriate because after all this surveillance and control and observation and slandering of those of us who disagree with the dominant narrative during the pandemic, and in particular slandering Piers, he was the most maligned person throughout the whole period. He was the enemy of the state. And so you should also make the subject access request, by the way. Get all the data
yes.
as to what they were up to. And I think what I read this morning was that Boris Johnson went to Ukraine in April 2022. So February they invaded, March, April. Beginning of April 2022, Boris Johnson went to Ukraine, and the Russians and Ukrainians had a deal they were going to sign. And Boris Johnson went there, instructions from America, scupper the deal. Promised the world to the Ukrainians. And now look what's happening. The ratio of deaths between the Russians and Ukrainians is between 1 to 3 and 1 to 7 on the part of the Ukrainians. So between 3 and 7 deaths for every Ukrainian, for one Russian. So it's a disaster for the Ukrainian people. An utter disaster for the Ukraine. And the idiots here egging them on. And they want you to have a flag, and they keep pushing the idea, we are defending freedom and democracy. All they're doing is prolonging a slaughter of the Ukrainian people with weapons provided by Britain that we don't use anymore, with weapons provided by France, by Germany, by Europe, by the United States of America. Meanwhile, they replace their own weapons with the latest AI technology. And a lot of the war, let's face it, people are sitting there being blown up by artificial intelligence drones that fly over the sky and blow people up. What sort of barbarity is that? And the war is now like the First World War. They sit in trenches, waiting to shoot each other, fighting over 20 yards of territory. In fact, if the Ukrainians had a hope in hell in the war, surely they would have defeated a ragtag and bobtail army in Bakhmut called the Wagner Group, who are composed of prisoners who were told you can come out of prison if you join the Wagner Brigade and fight against the Ukrainians. How can you expect the Ukrainians to be able to defeat an organized Russian army with about 30 times the forces that the Ukrainians have got if they lose in Bakhmut to a ragtag and bobtail of prisoners who've just come out of jail? They don't stand a hope in hell. And that's why I say between a 1 to 3 and 1 to 7 ratio of deaths, between 1 Russian and 3 to 7 Ukrainians are dying. So that is what our government is now promoting. And Boris Johnson was responsible for that. But of course, you have to be honest. The story about the Partygate thing is complete nonsense. That's dust in your eyes. That's throwing dust into your eyes. Oh my God, he was breaking rules. In other words, the rules should have been abided by. That's what they're saying. They want to reinforce the bullshit that we had to abide by the rules. And that's what the whole investigation is about. It's to promote the idea that the British population all abided by rules and regulations. We stuck up our arm for the country. We took it in the arm for the country. And yet, our leaders betrayed us. Now, the only reason Boris Johnson now is taking the stand, and that's why there's going to be all sorts of trouble in the Conservative Party now, is because Boris Johnson, now he's out, and that's his game. Now he's out. He knows he can mess up Rishi Sunak and all the rest of them. They were all involved in lying. They were all involved in parties. They all didn't believe a word of what they were saying. What they were interested in was getting money from Big Pharma and Big Tech, who were pushing the whole pandemic fear pornography that all of us were supposed to swallow, all of us were supposed to accept, in which they push all around the world, and is now resulting in a huge rise because of what they did. And they're all in it together. And it's not. The problem is, it wasn't just one. The journalists now say, "Oh my God, the journalists were being repressed by the Counter-Information Unit." And of course, the news came out from an organisation called Big Brother Watch, Silke, whatever her name is, some of the leader of Big Brother Watch. I remember Labour Party conference. Me and Piers, we had tickets to go to the meeting of Big Brother Watch.
Yes.
When we got to the meeting of Big Brother Watch, they banned us from entering the meeting. They said, "Oh no, you can't come in." So in other words, they want to now gradually release the story. Oh, there was manipulation of the news during the pandemic. Who thought it? Who thought it? Nobody knew. Suddenly we've discovered, horror of horrors, not every story was allowed to be circulated fully. But none of those politicians and representatives of Big Brother Watch. None of them were down here in Hyde Park when Praetorian guards and police came storming into the park like they were Roman soldiers in formation, attacking us over here and standing up and defending free speech. None of them defended free speech during the lockdowns. None of them. In fact, they attacked anyone who defended free speech and said we were playgrounds. And now they say anyone who opposes the war in Ukraine is pro-Russian. You know, some journalists have just come back from Russia. When they landed in the airport in England, they were detained by the immigration authorities and questioned by anti-terrorism units for reporting on what's happening in Ukraine. That's what's actually happening. That is a candidate for President of the United States of America. Probably none of you have heard that this candidate is standing. His name is Robert Kennedy Jr. By the way, I think you should make a campaign in London to support Kennedy in his election. Don't have to agree with everything he says, but he was systematic in exposing the role of Big Pharma. Before the pandemic broke out, decades before, he was campaigning on these issues. And yet they don't even put him on television. He's a Kennedy after all. He comes from like American royalty in politics, right? His uncle was murdered when he was president of the United States of America, probably by the CIA.
No.
And his father was murdered.
And you know it.
His father was murdered when he stood or tried to stand for president. So he comes from a long, if you like, I say, American royalty, and yet they refuse to put him on television. Well, what sort of world are we living in, where a Kennedy doesn't merit news on the television? I saw an article, one of these journalists, the great freedom-loving journalist, I think it was the Independent this week, and the article said, oh no, Guardian, and the article by some hack journalist said, how can there be 100 million possible candidates in America, 100 million people who could stand in America, and yet we get John Kennedy instead, a vax denier, a COVID denier. We get him instead. What is the state of world politics that we get him? And the truth of the matter is, the peculiarity is that Kennedy, all the polling shows that Kennedy could beat Donald Trump, and he could beat DeSantis, and he could beat Biden. But of course they'll do everything in their power to stop that from happening. But it's great that he's standing because it undermines the entire narrative we've been fed for 3 years. 3 years of madness, controlled by Big Pharma and Big Tech. Now Apple have released their latest machine. You put it on your head. You can see through it. It can see to you through cameras. You can click and the screen changes. You can interact in 3 dimensions with the world. That's where they want your children to go. That's where they want your children. Locked behind a screen for infinity. They want to undermine the very existence of humanity and replace you by a pseudo-robotic, augmented reality world in which you interact with the world all around the world through a screen, and where you don't interact with other human beings like we do here at Speaker's Corner, where it's all mediated by the Laura Koonsberg or the equivalent of that in the 3-dimensional metaverse or Appleverse that they want you sucked into. And they start out with $3,500, which by the way I think is quite cheap. I think they're doing it on purpose, making it as a launch product. $3,500 for a computer that fits on your head and can blow up to like a 100-meter screen. I think that's quite cheap, and I think they're doing it on purpose because they want to, just like the Google is free, like Facebook was free. Eventually, they make this machine so cheap that everybody has them. Everybody has them at home. You can learn at home. When the next pandemic, the next lockdown, the next crisis comes along, on comes the screen on your face and tells you what to do. And it's pre-programmed with artificial intelligence, which is designed, ChatGPT and all the rest of it, to repeat the dominant narrative, which they call the scientific consensus. What is the scientific consensus? A lot of bullshit. There is no such thing as science equaling consensus. Science, by definition, is questioning, objective observance, verification, and refutation. It cannot be anything else. So if you cannot question what the so-called science is, you don't have any science. But they'll tell you, like we had a guy last week, some of you remember last week, some guy standing here going, what are your qualifications? How many of you questioned anything during the pandemic And then they turned around and said, what are your qualifications? Are you a doctor? Are you a nurse? Are you on the front line? On the front, this is a war, and you're in the trenches. And the people in the trenches were in the hospital while they were doing like Macarena on television with a mask on. You can do it for us as well. And so they've been basically grooming the world for this insane That's right, God. See, that's what he was doing during the lockdown. That's what he was doing. I know you love ballet dancing and all the rest of it. In recent years, here we have another friend doing the same thing, preparing you for the next crisis to come along. Of course, the other crisis, as I said, I can repeat the point, Sadiq Khan's cameras observe all the movement of all the cars. Not the cars that are breaking the ULEZ regulations, all the cars. And they're also capable of facial recognition. So they can observe all the people and all the cars everywhere in the city. That's why they've got the bloody things everywhere. They've got records with the driving authority as to who owns what car. So they know who lives in London and who's got cars that are non-ULEZ compliant. They don't need you to register and tell them. They know that already, who lives in London with what cars. So why do they need to observe everybody? Because it's not about the ULEZ. The ULEZ is a mechanism to enable the surveillance over the population of all kinds. Everywhere you go, everything you do, every penny you spend, every activity you engage in, and all through the mobile phone, every communication you've got, every association you've got. And that's the type of world they hope will allow them to overcome the limitations of capitalism and to create a marketplace for their goods and services, to make you enslaved under their control. That's all they want. They want to be certain they can sell their shit to you. Certain that you'll buy it. And more certain than you are as to what you'll do. That's the point of it all. That's why you get adverts come up on your screen. So how did they know that? You didn't even know you were going to go in that direction. But they got it there in front of you already. Because they've watched everything you've done on the internet for 20 years. No one else, no other human being has done that. The machines have done it. The machines are pre-programmed to reinforce and nudge you to accept their so-called scientific consensus, which is a tyranny over the world's population. That's what they want. That's what they're promoting. So, if so the task, of course, to wake up to this and challenge the existing order and the game they play on television in the political arena. Boris Johnson says this. I mean, Boris Johnson said a couple of clever things in his life. The rest of it nonsense.